Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. It helps more than you know, and it reminds me I'm not alone telling these stories. I never thought I would be the kind of woman whose own family would erase her name with such ease. I was raised to believe that family is a shelter, not a storm, that blood ties don't fray just because money enters the room. I learned the hard way that money doesn't change people, it reveals them. My name is Miriam, and for most of my life, I was the dependable one, the one who paid quietly, fixed problems before anyone noticed, and kept receipts folded neatly in drawers no one ever opened. I was the aunt who showed up early and left late, who slipped envelopes into purses and pretended they were nothing, who signed documents without asking for applause. I thought humility would protect me. I thought love would be enough. When my nephew Daniel announced his engagement, the family group chat exploded with hearts and blessings. Daniel was the firstborn son of my older sister Ruth, and in our family that meant something. It meant expectations, it meant tradition, it meant a wedding that would be talked about for years. I congratulated him like everyone else, sent flowers, and asked what they needed. Ruth called me that same night, her voice bright and hurried, already overwhelmed with guest lists and venues. She said, "Miriam, we don't know how we'll afford it all." I told her not to worry. I said it the way I always did, softly, like a secret. "I'll help," I said. I didn't say how much. I didn't say what it would cost me. I just said yes. Helping became paying, paying became planning. I covered the venue deposit, the catering advance, the dress alterations, the florist who wanted cash. I paid because I could and because I believed in celebrating family. I didn't attend tastings or fittings. I didn't hover. I trusted them. Ruth thanked me in passing, the way people thank the weather when it's convenient. Daniel hugged me once and said, "You're the best aunt." That was enough for me then. The first crack came quietly. I noticed my calls going unanswered, messages left unread. I chalked it up to stress. Weddings do that to people. Then I heard about a planning dinner I hadn't been invited to. A cousin mentioned it casually, asked why I couldn't make it. I laughed and said I must have missed the message. I didn't want to sound wounded. I didn't want to be dramatic. I told myself I was imagining things. The truth arrived in a single text message, cold and efficient, sent 3 weeks before the wedding. It was from Ruth. "Miriam, we've decided to keep the wedding very small, immediate family only. We hope you understand." I stared at my phone, reread the words until they blurred. Immediate family? I had buried my parents. I had helped raise her children when she worked double shifts. I had paid for the wedding she was now uninviting me from. My hand shook, but I typed back calmly. "Of course," I wrote, "if that's what Daniel wants." She replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was it. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself love isn't measured by invitations. But the night of the wedding, when photos started appearing online, my chest tightened. The room was full. Cousins, friends, neighbors, people I had never met. Immediate family apparently had a very flexible definition. I sat alone in my living room, the same living room where Ruth and Daniel had signed checks at my dining table, planning a celebration I was now watching through a screen. I felt foolish. I felt old. Mostly, I felt invisible. What hurt even more was realizing that no one had mentioned the money. No one offered to return a single dollar. The deposits, the balances, the last-minute extras I had covered without question, it was as if my contribution had evaporated along with my place at the table. I waited for a call, an explanation, an apology. None came. Days passed, then weeks. The silence was loud. I didn't confront them right away. That's not who I am. I sat with the pain, let it settle, tried to understand what I had done wrong. I replayed conversations, searched for offense. I found none. What I did find, slowly and clearly, was something else, a pattern I had ignored for years. I was useful when I paid and optional when I didn't. I was family when my wallet was open and distant when it closed. The wedding didn't change anything. It simply exposed it. There was something else they didn't know, something I had never felt the need to announce. Years earlier, after my husband passed, I had quietly consolidated our assets, the family home, the small rental properties, the business accounts that Daniel now worked for. Everything had been transferred into my name for simplicity, for protection. I had kept it that way out of habit, out of privacy. I didn't dangle it. I didn't remind anyone. I let them assume what they wanted. Assumptions can be very comfortable for people who benefit from them. A week after the wedding, Daniel called me for the first time in months. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. He said they were back from their honeymoon and wanted to talk about expanding the business. He spoke as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't been quietly cut out of one of the most important days of his life. He said, "We'll need some funding to move forward." That's when something inside me finally went still. Not angry, not bitter, clear. I told him we should meet, in person. He agreed easily, confident, unaware. We set a date, I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my house, the house they thought we all belonged to, the house I owned alone. I didn't plan revenge. I planned honesty. I realized then that the moral of my life had been forming for a long time, waiting for me to catch up. Generosity without boundaries isn't kindness, it's permission. When the day came, I laid out the documents on my dining table, deeds, statements, contracts, not as weapons, but as facts. I practiced my words, not to sound cruel, but to sound steady. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to speak the truth finally and let it land where it may. Daniel arrived first, alone, which surprised me. He walked into my dining room with the same confidence he'd always had, the kind that comes from never being told no. He hugged me briefly, already distracted, eyes scanning the papers spread neatly across the table. He asked if Ruth was coming. I told him she would be late. That was a small lie, but I needed time. Time for him to sit in the truth without his mother smoothing it over. He pulled out a chair and started talking immediately about growth, about opportunities, about how marriage had changed his perspective. I listened quietly, nodding the way I always had, letting him finish. When he finally paused, I slid one document toward him. It was the deed to the house. He frowned, not really looking at it yet. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, half smiling, as if this were a formality. I told him calmly that I wanted to be clear about a few things before we discussed money again. He shrugged, picked up the paper, and then I watched his expression change. Confusion first, then concentration, and then something like disbelief. He read my name once, twice, then looked up at me. "This must be old," he said. I shook my head. "It's current," I replied. My voice didn't waver. "Everything is current." He laughed softly, a reflex, a defense. "Aunt Miriam, you know this was always meant for the family." I let that sit between us. I didn't argue. I simply slid the next document forward. The rental properties, the business ownership papers, the account summaries. One by one, the story he thought he knew began to unravel. His laugh faded. His shoulders stiffened. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" he asked, his tone sharpening. That question cut deeper than he knew. I told him the truth. "Because no one ever asked," I said, "and because I didn't think I needed to announce my worth to be treated like family." Ruth arrived halfway through that sentence. She walked in briskly, already irritated, and stopped short when she saw the papers. Her eyes moved from the table to Daniel's face, to mine. "What is this?" she demanded. I gestured to the chair across from me. "It's clarity," I said. She didn't sit at first. She crossed her arms, the way she used to when we were children, and she thought she was right. "Are you doing this because you're upset about the wedding?" she asked. I took a breath. I'm doing this because I was uninvited from a wedding I paid for, and because my money was kept without explanation, and because you all assumed I would continue giving without ever being seen." Her face flushed. "We said we were sorry," she snapped. That was a lie. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I didn't raise my voice. "I said you sent a thumbs up emoji, and then you spent my money." Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel years of unspoken expectations pressing down on the room. Ruth finally sat, her posture defensive. "You're family," she said, as if that explained everything. "Family helps each other." I nodded. Family doesn't erase each other. Family doesn't decide who belongs based on convenience. Daniel spoke then, quieter, more cautious. He asked what this meant. I told him exactly what it meant. It meant the business expansion wasn't happening unless we renegotiated roles and respect. It meant the house was not a shared asset to be assumed. It meant my generosity was no longer automatic. Ruth's voice rose. She accused me of holding money over their heads. That hurt, even though I expected it. "I never held it over you," I said. "I hid it under the table and let you kick me while standing on it." There were tears then. Ruth cried first, loud and angry. She said I had embarrassed her son, that I was ruining his marriage before it even began. Daniel stared at the table, jaw tight. I waited. I let them feel it. I had spent a lifetime cushioning their feelings at the expense of my own. I wasn't going to do that anymore. When the room finally quieted, I told them something I had never said out loud. I told them how alone I felt watching that wedding through a screen, how small it made me feel to realize my presence was optional, but my money wasn't, how I had questioned my own value, my own place in the family. My voice shook then, just a little, not from weakness, but from truth. Daniel looked up at me, eyes glassy. He apologized, not perfectly, not eloquently, but sincerely. He admitted they hadn't thought it through, that things had gotten away from them. Ruth stayed quiet. When she finally spoke, her apology was measured, careful, more about smoothing things over than understanding. I accepted Daniel's apology. I told Ruth I needed time. Boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. In the weeks that followed, the family shifted. Some cousins stopped calling. Others suddenly remembered my birthday. I noticed who reached out with concern and who reached out with requests. The business was restructured, contracts rewritten. Daniel learned, slowly, what accountability looks like when it isn't theoretical. Ruth and I spoke less, but when we did, it was more honest. Painful sometimes, but honest. I stopped paying quietly. I started being asked. I didn't get an invitation redo. There was no grand gesture, no public apology. Life doesn't always wrap things up neatly. What I did get was my name back, my place at my own table. I learned that love without respect is a debt that never gets repaid. I learned that silence can be generosity's enemy. Most of all, I learned that owning something isn't just about deeds and accounts. It's about owning your story, your worth, and your right to be treated with dignity. Sometimes I still think about that wedding day, not with bitterness, but with clarity. It was the moment the illusion broke and the truth stepped in. And as painful as it was, I wouldn't trade that awakening for comfort. Because the woman who sat alone watching from a screen is not the woman telling this story now. This woman knows exactly what she owns and exactly what she will no longer give away for free. After that meeting, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't confronting them or laying out the truth. It was living in the quiet aftermath, where everything felt unfamiliar even though nothing had physically changed. My house was still my house. My mornings still smelled like coffee and old wood, but the way my phone stayed silent some days told me exactly where I now stood. When you stop being convenient, people have to decide whether they value you or just what you provide. That decision isn't always kind. Ruth didn't call for weeks. When she finally did, her voice was careful, like she was stepping onto thin ice. She asked how I was doing. I said I was fine, and I meant it in a way I had never meant it before. Fine didn't mean obedient anymore. It meant grounded. She told me the family was confused, that some people felt I had overreacted. I listened without interrupting. I could hear the unspoken message underneath. Be smaller again, make it easier for everyone else. I didn't take the bait. I told her I loved her and that loving someone doesn't require self-erasure. She didn't respond right away. Silence, I was learning, can be an answer. Daniel, on the other hand, started showing up differently. He called to ask questions instead of making assumptions. He read the contracts instead of skimming them. Once he asked if we could have lunch, just the two of us. We sat in a quiet place near the river, and he admitted he had grown up believing things would always work out because they always had. Someone had always covered the gap. I didn't tell him that someone was usually me. He already knew. I told him responsibility feels heavy at first, but it builds muscle. He nodded, eyes fixed on the water, and I saw a humility in him I hadn't seen before. It didn't erase the hurt, but it softened it. The family gatherings changed shape. Some holidays were suddenly small this year. Some invitations came late, almost as afterthoughts. I accepted some, I declined others. Each yes and no was deliberate. I wasn't punishing anyone, I was practicing something new. Self-respect feels awkward when you've spent a lifetime bending. At first, I second-guessed myself constantly. Was I being too harsh, too sensitive? Then I remembered the night of the wedding, the hollow ache in my chest, and the doubt quieted. Pain is a teacher. You don't forget the lesson once it's learned. One afternoon, a cousin I hadn't heard from in years called to ask about investing together. I laughed softly and said I wasn't interested. He sounded surprised, almost offended. That was when I realized how deeply the narrative had been written without my consent. I was the safety net, the quiet bank, the dependable auntie, never the decision maker, never the owner. Changing that story didn't make me popular, but it made me honest. Popularity fades, honesty stays. Ruth and I eventually had the conversation we'd been avoiding. It happened in her kitchen, over tea that went cold between us. She admitted she had resented my stability after her divorce, resented that I didn't need anyone to rescue me. Money had become a symbol she didn't know how to talk about without shame. Excluding me from the wedding, she said, had felt like reclaiming something, control maybe. Hearing that hurt, but it also explained things. Hurtful behavior often comes from unhealed places. Understanding doesn't excuse it, but it does loosen its grip. I told her I forgave her, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant moving forward with eyes open. The business stabilized. Profits grew more slowly but more honestly. Daniel earned his place instead of assuming it. I stepped back where it made sense and stepped in where it mattered. I stopped rescuing. I started mentoring. There's a difference. One creates dependence, the other creates strength. Watching him handle challenges without reaching for me first was strangely satisfying, not because he struggled, but because he learned. Late one evening, months after the wedding, I sat on my porch and thought about legacy. Not money, not property, but the example we leave behind. I realized that by finally standing up for myself, I had given my family something more valuable than a check. I had shown them that dignity isn't negotiable, that love doesn't require silence, that boundaries are not walls, they're doors with locks you control. I won't pretend everything healed perfectly. Some relationships remain distant, some never recovered. That's the cost of truth sometimes. But I also gained something I hadn't expected: peace. the kind that comes from alignment, from living in a way that doesn't require constant explanation. I sleep better now, I speak slower, I give less, but what I give comes from choice, not obligation. If there's a lesson in my story, it's this. Don't wait to be betrayed to understand your worth. Don't confuse being needed with being loved, and never assume people know your value if you keep hiding it to make them comfortable. I owned everything long before they knew it. What I was missing was ownership of myself. Once I claimed that, everything else fell into its proper place. As time went on, I noticed something subtle but powerful happening inside me. I was no longer bracing myself before family interactions. That low, constant anxiety I'd lived with for years, the one that whispered, "Be useful or be forgotten," began to loosen its grip. I didn't realize how much energy it took to maintain my old role until I stopped performing it. I started to understand that peace doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives quietly when you stop negotiating your own boundaries. There was a moment about a year after the wedding that crystallized this shift. Another family event was being planned, a large anniversary celebration for one of our elders. A group chat formed, buzzing with ideas and expectations. Someone suggested venues, another suggested catering, and then, almost on cue, a message appeared that said, "Miriam, you're so good at handling these things." The old me would have jumped in, offering to organize, to pay, to smooth. Instead, I typed back, "I'm happy to attend. I'm not able to organize or fund this." I pressed send and waited for the familiar wave of guilt. It never came. There was a pause in the chat. Then the conversation continued without me. No drama, no confrontation, just adjustment. That's when it hit me. People don't fall apart when you stop overextending. They adapt, or they drift. Either way, the world keeps turning. The fear that had kept me small for so long was built on an illusion. I had been holding up a structure that could stand without me. Realizing that was both humbling and freeing. Daniel called me that night. He told me he'd seen the message and wanted to check in. He said he was proud of me. Hearing that surprised me more than it should have. I told him I was proud of him too, not for the business successes, but for the way he'd grown into responsibility without resentment. We talked like equals, not benefactor and beneficiary. That shift alone felt like a quiet miracle. Ruth and I continued our careful dance. Some days were warm, others were stiff, but there was a new honesty between us. She no longer asked me for money outright. When she did need help, she asked with humility, and she accepted no as gracefully as yes. That change told me she was learning too. Growth doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like respect from a distance. I began sharing my story with a few friends, cautiously at first. I was surprised by how many nodded in recognition, how many women especially had been the silent pillar in their families, propping everyone up while disappearing themselves. We laughed about it, cried about it, and in those conversations I felt less alone. Betrayal isolates you. Shared truth reconnects you. One friend asked me if I regretted paying for the wedding. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I told her no. Regret implies I would change the past. I wouldn't. That experience, painful as it was, became the catalyst for everything that followed. It showed me the cost of unspoken expectations. It forced me to confront the imbalance I had normalized. Sometimes the price of a lesson is high, but the return is lifelong. I also learned something about forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't a transaction. It doesn't require the other person to fully understand or agree. It's a release, not a reconciliation. I forgave my family not because they deserved it perfectly, but because I deserved peace. Forgiveness didn't reopen my wallet, it reopened my heart, carefully, with limits. On quiet mornings, I would walk through my house and touch the walls, the furniture, the small imperfections that told the story of my life. This space had held grief, generosity, and now reclamation. Ownership felt different than it used to. It wasn't about control, it was about stewardship, about choosing what and who I invest in with intention. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself in my story, I want you to know something. You are not selfish for wanting to be acknowledged. You are not difficult for asking for respect. And you are not wrong for changing when you realize the old version of you was surviving, not living. Family dynamics can make us forget who we are. It takes courage to remember. I didn't lose my family. I lost an illusion of unconditional acceptance that was tied to my usefulness. What I gained was far more valuable. A sense of self that doesn't disappear when the checks stop clearing. A voice that doesn't shake when I speak the truth. And a life that feels like mine again. The wedding that once felt like a wound now feels like a marker. Before and after. Before, I gave without being seen. After, I chose myself, and everything aligned accordingly. That's not a revenge story. It's a return to dignity, to clarity, to a love that includes myself. There is a quiet moment that comes after you change your life, one no one warns you about. It's the moment when the adrenaline fades and you're left alone with who you are now, not who you were to everyone else, just you. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon, standing in line at the bank, watching a younger woman nervously count papers in her hands. She reminded me of myself years ago, always double-checking, always afraid of taking up too much space. I wanted to tell her it gets easier when you stop apologizing for existing, but some lessons can't be handed over. They have to be lived. My role in the family continued to evolve, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes gracefully. I noticed that when I spoke less, people listened more. When I stopped explaining myself, assumptions fell apart. At gatherings, I no longer rushed to fill silence or smooth tension. I let conversations land where they landed. That alone shifted the energy in the room. People sensed it. You don't need to announce boundaries when you embody them. There was a moment when Ruth tested me again, not maliciously, but out of habit. She mentioned a financial shortfall, let the words linger in the air, waiting for me to offer. I met her eyes and said, "I hope you find a solution." My tone was kind, steady. She blinked, nodded, and changed the subject. Later, she thanked me for being honest instead of resentful. That surprised me. I realized then that my old pattern hadn't just harmed me, it had enabled avoidance in others. Clarity, even when uncomfortable, can be a gift. Daniel invited me to his home one evening, months later. He and his wife cooked dinner themselves. No caterers, no show, just effort. They asked questions about my life that had nothing to do with money or business. I told them stories they had never heard, about my early marriage, about losing my husband, about rebuilding quietly without anyone noticing. His wife cried when I finished. She said she hadn't known. I told her that was the point. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just keeps going. That night as I drove home, I felt something settle in my chest. Not validation, not triumph, belonging. Real belonging doesn't come from what you provide. It comes from being seen fully, without conditions. That kind of belonging can't be forced. It has to be cultivated, often after uncomfortable truths come to light. I also began making choices just for myself, small ones at first. A trip I'd postponed for years, a class I'd always wanted to take. I spent money without justification, time without guilt. It felt rebellious, almost wrong, until it didn't. Caring for myself became as natural as caring for others had once been. Balance, I learned, isn't about equal giving, it's about intentional living. Some family members never adjusted. They remained distant, polite, but cool. I stopped trying to win them back. Not everyone is meant to walk with you through every season. Some people are only comfortable with the version of you that serves them. Letting go of that truth hurts less than holding on to it. One evening, I received a message from a stranger who had heard my story through a mutual friend. She thanked me for putting words to something she'd been carrying for decades. I stared at that message for a long time. Stories matter, not because they entertain, but because they reflect. We see ourselves in each other's courage. That realization gave my experience a meaning beyond my own healing. Looking back now, I see how easily my story could have gone another way. I could have swallowed the hurt, kept paying, kept smiling, and slowly disappeared. Many people do. They mistake endurance for virtue. But endurance without self-respect is just slow erosion. Choosing myself didn't make me harder. It made me whole. If you're still listening, still wondering whether standing up for yourself is worth the fallout, let me tell you this. The right people will rise to meet you. The rest will fall away. Both outcomes are necessary. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of alignment. I didn't lose everything when my family uninvited me from that wedding. I found myself, and that is a return on investment no one can take from me. By the time another year passed, the sharp edges of that betrayal had softened into something almost instructive. Not harmless, not forgettable, but useful. I noticed how often moments from that time surfaced when I was faced with new decisions. Should I speak up or stay quiet? Should I give or step back? Each time I asked myself a question I had never asked before. Am I doing this out of love or out of fear? The answer guided me more clearly than any advice ever had. There was a family crisis that tested this new way of being. One of our relatives fell ill suddenly, and the old panic set in. Phones rang, plans were made hastily. I was included in the calls this time, my opinion asked for openly. I listened, offered what I could emotionally, and then stated plainly what I could not do financially. No one argued, no one accused. The world did not collapse. Later, Ruth thanked me again, this time without hesitation. She said my clarity had helped everyone organize better. That was when I understood something important. Boundaries don't just protect you, they organize the people around you. I spent more time alone than I used to, but it didn't feel lonely. Solitude had become a companion, not a punishment. I read more. I sat with my thoughts instead of outrunning them. I realized how often I had used busyness and generosity to avoid sitting with grief I never fully processed after my husband's death. Giving had been my distraction. Slowing down allowed old sadness to surface and then, gently, to pass. Healing isn't loud. It's repetitive and quiet and deeply personal. One afternoon, I visited my husband's grave for the first time in years. I told him everything about the wedding, about the confrontation, about who I had become since he left. I laughed through tears and said out loud that he would have been proud of me for finally using my voice. Walking away from that place, I felt lighter, as if a conversation long overdue had finally been finished. Daniel continued to grow into himself. He made mistakes, owned them, fixed them. Watching him mature without my constant intervention felt like watching a plant finally take root after years in shallow soil. His marriage stabilized too. His wife and I developed a genuine relationship, one built on conversation rather than obligation. She once told me she admired my strength. I corrected her gently. It's not strength, it's alignment. She nodded like she understood. There were moments when guilt tried to sneak back in. It came disguised as nostalgia, as family jokes about how things used to be. I learned to smile without stepping backward. Growth doesn't require bitterness, but it does require memory. Forgetting is how cycles repeat. Remembering is how they end. I also noticed how my story changed when I told it. At first, it came out heavy, charged with hurt. Over time, it became steadier, clearer, less about what they did and more about what I learned. That shift told me healing was real. Pain that transforms into wisdom loses its sting. One evening, while sorting through old documents, I found receipts from the wedding. Every check, every transfer. I looked at them without anger. They were proof of who I had been, not who I was anymore. I filed them away and closed the drawer. Some chapters don't need to be reread to be honored. If there's something I wish someone had told me earlier in life, it's this. You teach people how to treat you not with words, but with patterns. Change the pattern, and the lesson follows. It's uncomfortable, it's slow, but it works. I don't regret my generosity. I regret my silence. And even that regret has softened into gratitude because it led me here, to a life where my presence isn't conditional, where my giving is chosen, where my worth is no longer up for negotiation. The wedding that once symbolized exclusion now symbolizes clarity, a line drawn, a truth spoken, a life reclaimed. And every day I live from that truth feels like quiet justice, the kind that doesn't need witnesses to be real. There came a day when I realized I no longer introduced myself through my relationships. I wasn't Ruth's sister or Daniel's aunt in my own mind anymore. I was simply Miriam. That shift was subtle but profound. It changed the way I walked into rooms, the way I listened, the way I chose silence or speech. I had spent so long defining myself by what I meant to others that I had forgotten to ask who I was to myself. I began volunteering at a local community center, not as a benefactor, but as a participant. I showed up to help organize, to listen, to sit with people who needed company more than solutions. No one knew my family history there. No one expected anything beyond presence. It was refreshing to exist without a backstory that came with assumptions. I made friends who valued my time, not my resources. That kind of connection heals something deep. Ruth noticed the change before she commented on it. She said I seemed lighter, more settled. There was a hint of admiration in her voice that hadn't been there before. She admitted she was learning from me, slowly, how to say no without guilt. Hearing that softened something between us. We weren't the sisters we used to be, but we were becoming something more honest. Sometimes relationships don't return to their old shape. They evolve into something sturdier. The family as a whole adjusted in small ways. They stopped making plans that assumed my involvement. They started asking instead. That single word changed everything. Asking implies choice. Choice implies respect. It took a betrayal to get us there, but we got there. One evening, Daniel asked me if I would walk him through the early days of the business, not the numbers, but the mindset. He said he wanted to understand how I had built something quietly without recognition. I told him about patience, about resisting the urge to prove yourself, about letting consistency speak louder than promises. I also told him about the cost of being invisible, a cost I hadn't understood until much later. He listened closely. I hoped he would learn the lesson earlier than I did. As years layered over that wedding day, it became a story I could tell without my voice tightening. It turned into a reference point, not a wound. I could look back and see how necessary it was, how it forced every hidden dynamic into the light. Comfort rarely demands change. Discomfort does. There was a final conversation with Ruth that closed a loop I didn't know was still open. She told me she was proud of me, not for what I owned, but for what I had claimed. herself. She said excluding me from the wedding was one of the greatest regrets of her life. I believed her. Regret doesn't always come with repair, but it can come with growth. I told her I was proud of her too, for facing it instead of burying it. We cried together, quietly, without accusation. That felt like healing. I often think about listeners who might be hearing this story in pieces of their own lives. The aunties, the uncles, the quiet ones who carry families without being named. If you're one of them, I want you to know that your value isn't hidden in what you give. It's present in who you are, even when no one is looking, especially then. I no longer measure my life by how indispensable I am. I measure it by how aligned I feel when I wake up each morning, by how rarely I second-guess my boundaries, by how often I laugh without scanning the room for approval. These are small metrics, but they matter. The truth is, my family never meant to teach me this lesson, but they did, and I took it. I took the pain and turned it into clarity. I took exclusion and turned it into self-inclusion. I took silence and turned it into a voice that speaks gently, firmly, and only when it needs to. Owning everything was never the point. Owning myself was. Once I understood that, the rest became just details. There's a strange calm that settles in once you stop waiting for people to become who you needed them to be. I didn't notice it right away. It arrived quietly in moments that used to feel loaded and now felt neutral. A family call that ended without tension. A holiday spent exactly the way I wanted. A decision made without rehearsing explanations in my head. These weren't dramatic victories. They were quiet confirmations that something fundamental had shifted. I stopped imagining alternate versions of the past. I no longer replayed the wedding in my mind, wondering what I could have said or done differently. That story had finished telling me what it needed to tell me. I learned that closure doesn't always come from apologies or reconciliation. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. Acceptance that people are limited. Acceptance that love can coexist with disappointment. Acceptance that you don't need everyone's understanding to move forward. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, I came across pictures from years before Daniel was born. Pictures of me laughing, dancing, alive in ways I had forgotten. I realized how much of myself I had tucked away to be palatable, dependable, easy. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me curious. Who might I become if I allowed that woman back into my life, not as nostalgia, but as possibility? I started saying yes to things that had nothing to do with family or responsibility. Art exhibits, long walks, conversations that wandered instead of served a purpose. I gave myself permission to be unproductive, to exist without justification. For someone who had built her identity on usefulness, this was radical and deeply healing. Ruth and I had a conversation one evening that stayed with me. He said he had always assumed authority came from being loud or assertive. Watching me, he said, had taught him that authority can come from stillness, from knowing when to step forward and when to step back. Hearing that felt like legacy in its truest form. Not money passed down, but wisdom earned and shared. Ruth and I continued to rebuild something quieter than what we once had. We didn't talk every day. We didn't pretend nothing had happened. But when we did talk, it was real. She once admitted she had envied my independence, not my wealth. That admission explained years of tension better than any argument ever could. We are closer now, in a way that doesn't rely on illusion. I also learned to recognize manipulation when it appeared, even in subtle forms. A sigh meant to prompt rescue, a joke meant to guilt. I met those moments with kindness and clarity instead of compliance. People adjusted, or they didn't. Either way, I stayed steady. If there's a deeper moral in all of this, it's that self-respect changes the rules of every relationship you're in. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to demand it. You live it, and the world responds accordingly. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had been invited to that wedding, if everything had gone smoothly, if my role had remained unquestioned. I suspect I would still be giving from an empty place, still confusing obligation with love. Exclusion hurt, but it also interrupted a pattern that was slowly erasing me. Now, when I give, it's because I want to, not because I'm afraid of losing my place. And when I don't, I don't. That freedom is priceless. The irony is this: my family thought excluding me would diminish me. Instead, it introduced me to myself. And that is something no one can ever take away. As the years continued to pass, my life settled into a rhythm that felt honest. Not perfect, not untouched by conflict, but honest. I no longer rushed to prove anything. I let days unfold instead of managing them. I noticed how much quieter my mind had become. When you stop living in reaction to other people's expectations, your thoughts finally have room to breathe. There was a family reunion one summer that tested how far we had all come. It was held at a rented hall, full of long tables and familiar laughter. I arrived on my own schedule, not early, not late. When I walked in, conversations paused for just a moment, not out of tension, but recognition. People greeted me warmly, without the undertone of entitlement that used to cling to every interaction. No one handed me a problem to solve. No one whispered about logistics. I was simply a guest. I sat where I wanted, ate what I liked, left when I was tired. That day felt like a quiet graduation. At one point, an older relative pulled me aside and said, "You seem different." I smiled and said, "I feel different." That was enough. I didn't explain, I didn't justify. Some transformations are meant to be observed, not narrated. Later that evening, Daniel stood up to give a small toast. It wasn't planned. He spoke about family, about lessons learned the hard way, about gratitude that arrives late but sincere. Then he looked directly at me and said, "Thank you." Not for money, not for support, but for teaching him what accountability looks like when it's wrapped in dignity. The room was quiet. I felt no urge to cry. I felt complete. Ruth sat beside me afterward, her hand resting briefly on mine. It was a simple gesture, but it carried years of repair. We didn't need to revisit the past. It had already done its work. Sometimes healing isn't loud reconciliation. Sometimes it's shared silence that doesn't hurt. When I returned home that night, I thought about how different everything felt from the woman I had been watching a wedding through a screen. That woman believed love required endurance. This one understood that love requires mutuality. Endurance without reciprocity is not devotion, it's depletion. I began writing more, journaling the small insights that came with this new phase of life. I wrote about the cost of being agreeable, about the freedom in being clear, about how often we teach people to overlook us by pretending we don't mind. Putting those thoughts on paper felt like closing loops inside myself. If there's one truth I wish could reach every listener, it's this: you don't have to wait for a dramatic betrayal to choose yourself. You don't have to own everything to realize you deserve something. Respect isn't a luxury, it's a baseline. And the moment you treat it that way, your life begins to rearrange itself around that truth. My family didn't change overnight, neither did I. Growth was gradual, uneven, sometimes uncomfortable, but it was real, and real change lasts longer than forced harmony ever could. The wedding that once symbolized exclusion now barely holds emotional weight. It's just a chapter. Important, yes. Defining, yes. But not the whole story. The rest of my life has been lived with intention, clarity, and a calm confidence I didn't know I was allowed to have. I owned everything they thought mattered, but the greatest thing I own now is peace, and that I protect fiercely. In this later chapter of my life, I've learned to appreciate endings just as much as beginnings. Not dramatic endings, not doors slamming shut, but gentle conclusions that feel earned. The kind where nothing is left unsaid because nothing needs to be said anymore. That's where I found myself with my family. Not perfect, not fused back together the way it once was, but settled, balanced, real. I noticed that my body responded differently to stress now. My shoulders didn't tense the way they used to when my phone rang. My stomach didn't drop when a family message came through. I wasn't bracing for obligation. I was open to connection. That difference alone told me how deeply the old pattern had lived in me and how thoroughly it had finally loosened. There was one last financial matter to resolve, a formality tied to the business. Daniel handled it himself. He brought the documents, explained the details clearly, and asked thoughtful questions. At the end, he thanked me for trusting him to manage it without hovering. I thanked him for earning that trust. The exchange was calm, mutual, adult. As he left, I felt something close to pride, not the pride of ownership, but the pride of witness, watching someone grow because you stepped back instead of stepping in. Ruth and I developed a new ritual, occasional walks, just the two of us, no problem solving, no revisiting old grievances. We talked about books, about aging, about the strange relief of no longer needing to prove ourselves. Once she said quietly that she wished she had been braver sooner. I told her bravery often comes after consequences. That doesn't make it less valid, it makes it human. I also learned how to receive without discomfort. Compliments no longer made me deflect. Care no longer made me suspicious. When someone offered help, I considered it instead of automatically declining or repaying it with something bigger. Letting others show up for me felt like learning a new language, awkward at first, then fluent. The biggest shift, though, was internal. I no longer measured my worth by my absence being noticed. I didn't need to be missed to feel valuable. I felt valuable simply existing, simply choosing, simply being. That's a quiet revolution for someone who spent decades being the backbone behind the scenes. Sometimes people ask me if I ever told the wider family that I owned everything. The answer is no. I didn't need to. Power that needs to be announced is fragile. Power that's lived is steady. The people who needed to know learned. The rest didn't matter. When I think back to the day I was uninvited from that wedding, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel gratitude, oddly enough. That moment stripped away illusions I didn't know were costing me my life force. It forced me to stand still long enough to see myself clearly. Pain can be a mirror if you let it. If you're listening and you're at the beginning of a similar reckoning, I won't tell you it's easy. It isn't. Choosing yourself can feel like standing alone in a crowded room. But if you stay with it, if you don't retreat into old habits just to feel included, something extraordinary happens. You begin to attract relationships that don't require you to disappear. I didn't lose my family. I lost my role as a silent provider. And in that loss, I gained something infinitely more sustaining. A life where my generosity has roots, not leaks. A life where love and respect walk side by side. A life where I no longer confuse being needed with being cherished. And as this chapter draws to a close, I can say this with certainty. Everything I own now feels lighter because I'm no longer carrying everyone else on my back. By the time I reached this stage of my life, I realized something fundamental. The hardest lessons often arrive disguised as betrayal. That wedding, which once felt like a cruel exclusion, had been one of the most necessary experiences of my life. It forced me to confront the patterns I had normalized for decades, the constant giving, the quiet labor, the assumption that love was measured by what I provided. Pain, it turns out, can be a catalyst for clarity if you're willing to face it instead of numbing it. The final months of reconciliation with my family were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic reconciliations, no emotional speeches that solved everything. It was a series of small moments that added up to a shift in energy. Daniel called me before making business decisions, genuinely seeking my advice rather than assuming access. Ruth stopped leaving messages unanswered, started asking instead of expecting. Even the cousins who had once leaned on me without noticing me now treated my input as a choice, not an obligation. That subtle recalibration of respect and awareness was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. I began to understand that the story I had carried about myself, the one that framed me as expendable, invisible, and necessary only when it suited others, was not true. It was a narrative I had absorbed by default, never questioned because I was too busy being useful. But the moment I took ownership, both literally of my assets and figuratively of my life, everything changed. Ownership isn't just about property. It's about boundaries, about knowing your value, about refusing to let anyone erase your existence quietly. One afternoon, I went through the old wedding receipts just to see them again. It was oddly liberating. I remembered each check, each transaction, each moment I had silently supported them, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I smiled quietly, thinking about the irony. They believed they were benefiting from me without consequence, but every lesson I had learned from that experience was mine alone. Every ounce of growth, every hard-won sense of self was beyond their reach. The money, the house, the accounts, they were just symbols. The real wealth was in knowing I would never again give without recognition or choice. I also began mentoring a few young women in my community, sharing not just financial wisdom, but life lessons. I told them about the cost of invisibility, about the weight of overextending yourself quietly, about how love and generosity don't require self-erasure. They listened with wide eyes and sometimes tears, and I felt a quiet satisfaction. If one person could step into their own power a little sooner because of my story, then all the isolation and hurt I endured had purpose. My life had finally extended beyond survival into meaning. Even Ruth and I reached a place of true understanding. She no longer viewed my independence as a threat or a challenge. We didn't return to the closeness of our youth, but we built a steadier, more respectful relationship. We could speak honestly, disagree, and still feel connection. That, I realized, was better than the old closeness that had depended on me suppressing myself. It wasn't warmth earned by sacrifice. It was warmth built on mutual recognition. Daniel matured too, in ways I had never expected. Watching him navigate the business with care and humility, taking responsibility without resentment, was like seeing a young man step fully into adulthood. I didn't intervene unless necessary. I offered guidance, not rescue. It was a remarkable thing to witness, and I felt a pride I hadn't thought possible. Pride not tied to what I had provided, but to what I had helped nurture responsibly. Through all this, I learned to sit in silence comfortably. No longer did I feel the need to fill empty spaces with solutions, explanations, or money. Silence became a tool, not a threat. I listened, I reflected, I spoke when it mattered, and that balance created a calm I had never known. True presence, I realized, is not about being needed, it is about being whole. I also learned the hardest truth. Some people won't change, and some relationships won't fully recover. That's okay. Respecting myself meant accepting that not everyone deserved full access to me, my time, or my energy. I learned that boundaries do not harm love, they preserve it. I learned that exclusion doesn't diminish me, overextension once did. And I learned that owning myself, my choices, my voice, my presence is more important than any title, property, or social approval. Now, when I look back at that wedding, I don't see betrayal or humiliation. I see clarity. I see the exact moment my life demanded I pay attention to myself, that my value was not contingent on how I served others. I see a catalyst that forced me to define who I am, not by what I give, but how I show up as myself. That realization has allowed me to live freely, openly, and with intention. I also see that the lessons were not just for me. They were a message to anyone who has ever been taken for granted, erased quietly, or undervalued. It's a story about reclaiming power without bitterness, about cultivating self-respect in the face of expectation, about understanding that generosity without boundaries is unsustainable. And most importantly, it's about discovering that the greatest ownership one can ever have is over oneself. In the end, I didn't just reclaim what I owned financially. I reclaimed my life, my dignity, my voice. I learned that giving is a gift, but only when it's chosen freely. And I learned that the most valuable inheritance we leave is not money or property, but the courage to stand for ourselves, to set limits, and to live aligned with our truth. That is the legacy I hold now, quietly and proudly, and nothing can take it from me. The wedding is no longer a wound or a point of anger. It's a marker, a turning point, a reminder that life is often harsh, but its lessons are precise. And when you finally listen, you find a way to reclaim not just what was taken, but who you were always meant to be. I am Miriam. I paid for a wedding I didn't attend. I was uninvited, overlooked, and underestimated. And yet I stand here, owning everything that truly matters: my life, my choices, and my peace. The end.